All right, so I've talked about the importance of blocking pump light from making it to the detector in a time domain thermoreflectance system, but there are a couple of different ways that we can do that. So we're all two tint designs rely on polarization first as the first line of defense. So the probe beam and the pump beam are polarized differently, and so a polarizing beam splitter removes. Polarizing beam splitter, let me grab my laser pointer. A polarizing beam splitter here basically prevents most of the pump light from making it back towards the photodiode, but not all of it. It only tends to reject something like 1 part in 200, or if you have a really good one, it might be closer to 1 part in 1,000, but it's still not enough in general. And that's especially true if you have a rough sample where the light that's coming back from the sample may be losing the polarization information as it reflects back. So in those situations, you need more. And so David Cahill's group back in the late 2000s developed a technique called a two-tint technique, which is the basis for the name. And basically what it is a set of optical filters that helps distinguish the pump and probe beam not just by polarization but also by wavelength. The reference is actually at the top of the slide here. So it's Kang et al., which Cahill is the final author. And you can look up this paper for the details of how they did it, but I think it's quite easy to understand, actually. So a femtosecond laser, as I've discussed, is not actually a single wavelength. So like when you tune your laser or whatever, however you do your mode locking, suppose you say that the wavelength is 785 nanometers. Well, that's true, but that really only represents the center wavelength. A femtosecond laser actually has a broad, somewhat broad spectrum of wavelengths that come out. So if you're dealing with a typical femtosecond laser with like 100 femtosecond duration, then you can expect that, if you're really getting that 100 femtoseconds, that there's probably about a 10 nanometer wavelength variation or spectrum coming out, centered around 785 nanometers. And that presents an opportunity, which is to use sharp optical filters to actually divide that 10 nanometer or more wavelength spread into two different laser beams at two different wavelengths. So the basic idea here is to use optical filters that divide the pump beam and the probe beam by wavelength. I'll give you some examples of some filters right now. And then after we've divided the two laser beams by wavelength, we'll basically use another optical filter that only allows the pump or the probe beam to make it to the detector. So as an example, so this is actually the image from Kang's paper. So I have a two-tint optical system, and you'll notice these three optical filters here. There's one on the pump beam, one on the probe beam, and another one right before the photodiode. Well, let's think about what the spectrum of light looks like as we go down this system. So if I look at either the pump or the probe beam before the laser beams make it to any optical filters, both the pump beam and the probe beam look the same in terms of their spectrum. So this is counts, so intensity versus wavelength. They have, this... they're centered around 785 nanometer wavelength, but it's broad. It's, maybe more than 10 nanometers in width. So if, for example, on the probe beam, so this is the probe path that I've highlighted here with this red, if I put an optical filter that is meant to only allow short wavelengths through, I can basically chop this Gaussian-looking thing in half. So I can filter the probe beam with an optical filter, and here I've given the name of a particular filter. So this is actually from some data taken from my TDTR using a spectrum analyzer. So what I have here is essentially a spectrum of my laser beam after a ultra steep short pass filter. And you'll see that basically all it does is it takes this Gaussian and it chops it in half and only takes the left half. So I can choose a short pass filter that does that, and then I can take my pump pulse and I can divide it in exactly the opposite way. I'll take, instead of using a short pass filter, I'll just use a long pass filter. So I'll allow the other side of the spectrum through, and that'll be my pump beam. And then when it bounces, so both of these lasers will head towards the sample, bounce off the sample. Now, the polarizing beam splitter will knock off a pretty good portion of, like, maybe a part in 200 or 200 parts, out of 201 out of the reflected beams. But still, there's still some very small fraction, like 1/100th of the light, will make it to the photodiode, the back photodiode, if you do nothing else. And so it's important to remove that portion of the pump beam. And so what we'll do is I'll just take the exact same filter that I used for my probe to create my probe beam, and I'll put it right in front of the photodiode. And in that case, I'm only going to allow short wavelength stuff through. Oh, sorry, there's one more image here, which is to show that in these two spectrums, there is essentially no overlap in intensity between the pump and the probe spectrally. So if I put a short wavelength filter that only allows through this half of the Gaussian beam, then what I'll do is transmit just my probe beam. And in that case, I can reject the pump beam, even if there's some diffuse light coming off the sample that has lost memory of polarization. And in that case, I can get a really nice signal on my detector that is purely due to the probe beam. So in that way, I can reject any false signals associated with leaked pump light. So that is basically the strategy behind using two tint filters, and it's quite effective for removing both the portion of the portion that makes it through the polarizing beam splitter, and especially that's true whenever there's diffusely scattered light from the sample.